Alice Ariori. Alice has also been on our program before, and Alice is the project administrator building elections integrity through partnerships, TIPNG. To you both, welcome and good morning, or good day. We're getting towards the middle of the day anyway.
Good morning and good day, Stephen.
Yeah. How are we both?
Well, thank you for having us on this morning to speak with NBC and your listeners. We're really pleased to be here to ensure that our fellow Papua New Guineans are informed about some of these processes and the electoral corruption that sometimes often occurs. And people in Papua New Guinea often have questions around elections and the processes. So Transparency National PNG is here to really speak to those issues so our fellow Papua New Guineans are informed in the lead up to our 2022 national elections.
Alice, thank you for that. Yumbari, how are you? Since the last time we spoke, it looks like you've been really busy.
Yeah, I'm good. As Yua has said, we're not only here to share the election processes, but also to share very important key messages to the general public.
Okay, so this morning, as we start off our first program in this understanding between Transparency International and the National Broadcasting Corporation, what better way to start than with a very heavy topic called corruption. So what is the causes of corruption, the corruption from elections perspective, how can we minimize it, how can we recognize it maybe at times, and all of these questions. So let's start off with what is corruption. Iwambari.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think at the outset we want to, Transparency National PNG also acknowledge the support of the National Broadcasting Corporation, its administration, for allowing us to have this partnership for this series of panel discussions around elections integrity. I think this question of what is corruption is really a key one. Often in Papua New Guinea and in Papua New Guinean discourse, as you're well aware, the issue of corruption comes up as one of the root causes for many of the societal issues that we face. And unfortunately, Papua New Guineans, while they might see the impacts of corruption, have a poor understanding of what corruption is. And because of that poor understanding, they also have maybe a lack of understanding of how solutions can be implemented to address corruption. In a lot of the awareness work that Alice and I have done, not just for elections but around corruption generally, when we go out to the communities, we ask them, what do you think corruption is? And often they say, corruption is any wrong thing that happens. It could be gender-based violence, or it might be alcohol or substance abuse, or theft, or any other societal ill that the people come across. But while these are all things that Papua New Guineans want to avoid, for Transparency International and practitioners in this space of good governance, there is a technical definition of corruption. Tokpiksa mosem sopos yusik na yugolo doctor ba asking you cool, or you are right lo sana you can walk about. So when we are trying to talk about corruption, it's important to diagnose what corruption is and identify the symptoms so that we can better treat it. So there are three components to what corruption is. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. So those three components are that there has to be a person who has been entrusted with power, and that power can be, a responsibility of a public office. It can be a custodian of a particular process, and they choose to abuse that process. They know what the correct thing to do is, and they choose to go the wrong way and abuse that process. And by doing so, they get personal gain out of it. It can be direct monetary gain, it can be social status, it can be assets. So when you see a case where someone who has been entrusted with a process or power abuses that power and they gain from it, that is a case of corruption. And it occurs across multiple facets of public life. So it's an issue that has plagued the country and that we have to be able to discuss clearly so that we can better address it.
Yeah. If it's intentional, that's understood. What if it's unintentional? Or would you have found that in a lot of times, some people probably know, some people don't know, maybe don't know that they're doing the wrong thing?
Yeah. So when you have a process that you're a custodian of, that component of abuse is important. You cannot abuse something out of ignorance. It often has an intent. So abuse means that you know what the process is. So for example, if you're a police officer and you have a roadblock that you're conducting in a city, and you have a vehicle that comes and it infringes the Road Traffic Act, and rather than soliciting a payment at that spot, you should be taking them to Boroko and asking them to fill in the proper paperwork and receipt them for the payment of the fine if it's found to be a correct fine. So when you abuse that process, you have to know what the right process is. So that component of abuse is important.
So there you go. That's a very simple way of saying that's corruption.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got different types of corruption. We've got a few here, and I'll just off the top of the sheet that I have here, but Umbari will go through all of these: bribery, nepotism, blackmail, political influence, and theft. Please, Umbari, if you can expound on those.
Yeah. So going back to the definition of the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain, again to your listeners, that is the technical definition of corruption, and there are different ways that it expresses itself. So you don't just get one form of corruption. Corruption is not always someone in a suit in a hotel somewhere receiving money.
In other words, it's broad.
It's broad. You can have bribery, which is where you have someone, requesting money or offering money to abuse a process. That's a form of corruption. On the other side, you might have something that's a bit meaner, which is blackmail, where someone threatens to release information and forces you to abuse a process. Or you might even have extortion, which is the threat of violence. If you don't do this, we'll come and find where you live and do something to you and your family. Those are all forms of corruption if they result in someone abusing a process for personal or private gain. Even something as basic as theft, you mentioned. If you have been entrusted with public assets and you hold on to those assets, we had an interesting case a few years back where you had a public official who was elected into office and then received under public funds, public equipment for the purposes of roadworks. After they lost the elections, they went and used those same public resources to then start up their own company to get contracts. So that's theft of public assets. There's also a form of corruption. So people might get confused by the different types of corruption you come across, and that's why TIPNG emphasizes that point of looking out for those three components of corruption. Whenever someone is in a position of power, abusing that power, and they gain from that abuse.
Let me ask you this one. This is probably in recent times, a lot of people would have heard about it. Sometime last year, there was an ultimatum put out by the government, and this was around the APEC report. And some of the issues about these vehicles that had been put out, they haven't been returned. We're seeing number plates, being put out there. Is that a form of corruption?
So this is why the diagnosis and the criteria I mentioned is really clear. TIPNG offers a free legal advice center which can receive public complaints of witnesses or victims of corruption. And when we ask them, when you report this corruption, can you identify the person who is in a position of power? Are you able to substantiate that they have abused that power? And can you demonstrate that they've gained from that abuse? So to your questions around the public vehicles, if we can demonstrate that the public official who was entrusted with those vehicles abused that process or their powers to obtain those vehicles, and then they benefited by driving those vehicles around looking very expensive, very flashy, then that would be a case of corruption. But it's important to demonstrate those components, because otherwise you just have hearsay, speculation, political opportunism, and it's why it's important to have that definition of corruption in mind.
Okay, thank you for that. Alice, you want to come in on? Oh, I think she's got the next segment, which is around the corruption from elections perspective. But thank you for highlighting all of that, the different types around bribery, nepotism, blackmail, political influence, and theft. Now, maybe let's just, before we get to Alice, political influence is one that's going to be very important this year, because of the national general elections. When politicians are too close to people who want to influence their decisions. Already we're seeing examples of current members of parliament, or some who might be close to these people, going around. And of course we all know it's a national general election year. But is that early campaigning? Can you see that as early campaigning? Your thoughts about political influence?
Yeah, so I think maybe to just unpack that issue, maybe separate from early campaigning, just to unpack what we mean by political influence and why it's a form of corruption. Political influence is also classified as undue influence, and that means influence where it shouldn't be there. So, for instance, if you have someone that is in charge of a process and they know that the minister is going to call them up and ask them, why didn't you make the decision this way, for an example. So that is a form of undue influence or political influence in a process. You'll find in the processes that we have in our country, there is something called accountability. And there's a separation of processes so that we can have checks and balances in our systems. When you have a political decision maker influencing administrative decision makers, that is where you have maybe undue influence, conflicts of interest, and that leads to corruption, particularly if it results in that administrator then abusing their position for the benefit of either themselves or the political influencer that's coming in and trying to get them to abuse that process. This is obviously, as you've highlighted, an issue in the elections, and I know your listeners are really keen on discussing the elections and making sure we iron out those issues as well. And it's very important that those custodians of our electoral processes, whether they be the Electoral Commission that delivers the elections, the police that ensures the security, the provincial administrators that assist with the logistics, do not abuse those processes for personal or private gain, either from political influence or for their own personal benefit. And this is why Alice and I are here on this morning to really emphasize where we see elections, corruption occurring, and also to assist your listeners to be better able to then ensure that if they see this malpractice happening, that they are more informed and able to be better voters in our election.
You're empowering them.
Exactly.
Empowerment. Thank you for that, Yombari. What is corruption? That's the first part of this program. Once again, building elections integrity through partnership with the Transparency International and, of course, the National Broadcasting Corporation. Let's go to our next point. What is corruption from the elections perspective? Maybe that's a nice segue. And here we go with Alice. Your response to that particular question. What is corruption from the elections perspective?
Thank you. As what you have mentioned, bribery is a really classical example of corruption in election. Exchanging votes for money is also an example of corruption in elections. And here at Transparency International, we work to uphold the integrity of the electoral process, and we believe that citizens need vital election information to be prepared to make informed choices. The more informed citizens are, the less likely corruption will occur in the elections. And that is the very reason why you and I are here today to share those very important key messages with everyone listening today, and to be also engaged in the upcoming elections as well. And I'll let you maybe add a little bit more on that.
Yeah, but I think it's important for us to also explain on the Building Elections Integrity Through Partnership project and what some of the activities TIPNG has been doing in this space. And particularly Alice and the team have been out to the provinces, and we've been trying to work with partners in the provinces on how we can strengthen elections integrity. TIPNG, as Alice mentions, recognizes that the importance of the elections and integrity in elections cannot be addressed by one single institution. It has to be done in partnership, and it requires informed citizens, informed partners. So Alice and the elections team within TIPNG have been running a series of activities, and some of your listeners in the provinces might have heard about our teams coming out and speaking about election awareness. So I'll just let Alice also give an update on some of the awareness activities that we've been doing.
Okay. So we've done election activities in 4 provinces so far. The first province we went out to do the election awareness is New Britain. Then we did the awareness, similar awareness for Central Province, ECPIC and Milne Bay. So our awareness that we did was mostly with churches, corporate organizations like IRC. We did one with IRC in ECPIC, and also Ombudsman Commission in East New Britain. And we held a one-day workshop with different stakeholders and civil society organizations. So we invited them together for a day and gave a presentation on the upcoming elections.
Okay, and it sounds like that that there's a fair bit, but of course 4 provinces is just 4 provinces. There's so many others as well. Yombari, you can come in on this as well. When we talk about bribery, an example of corruption in elections in exchanging votes for money. For example, in the campaigning period, sometimes people you hear about, okay, well, this particular intending candidate has come in and all of a sudden they're giving out merchandise or what you may, or killing a pig and telling everybody, look, come and let's all. But specifically when it comes to the issue of money during a time of politics, in recent times people have already started saying, well, in Papua New Guinea, elections are centered around money. In other words, if you have a lot of money, you're going to have the power to buy votes. And some say that this used to happen in a particular part of the country, but it's now happening almost everywhere. Is this not an unfair advantage, but is from what you guys have been advocating about, is this the truth about people buying votes?
Yes, and I think at the outset it's important to emphasize that selling of votes is an illegal act under the law. People that engage in selling of their votes and people that solicit payments, so when you go and you ask someone to either give you money, or there might be someone cutting up a pig and distributing it to households, or coming and giving a donation. It doesn't have to be just cash. It can be anything in kind, and it's called bribery, because you're soliciting some kind of benefit to be able to then cast your vote for that person. For TIPNG, as you are aware, and the listeners will be aware as well, we've been engaged in a process of observation of elections. That's domestic election observation, and we've had in the last 2017 national elections over 300, 400 observers across the country, just volunteering their time, giving 1 or 2 days to go out and see what is happening at polling stations across the country. And the incidence of bribery in our country during the elections has increased. And in the 2017 elections report that TIPNG released after the conduct of the elections, we said it was one of the worst elections we've ever had in the country. And bribery is definitely an issue. And to your point about it only being in one part of the country, that's not the case. It's happening. It happens in different forms across different parts of the country. You hear of people going out and giving roofing iron to people in the villages and saying, oh, if only I had a bit more money after the elections, we could get more roofing iron. And it's not just the people that are already in power, it's the people, like you said, that are challenging and contesting seats. One of the scary things that we saw in Port Moresby, in the recent Moresby Northwest by-election in 2021, was the modernization of corruption, and it's a really scary thing. And we had people going up to polling booths, which are supposed to have secret voting, and they would go in with their mobile phones and take pictures of the vote that they had cast on their ballot, WhatsApp that photo to the person that they were campaigning with, so that they could then get their payment after they left the polling station. That's how insidious the problem has become in our country. And this is why TIPNG and partners like NBC are going out to remind people that you're selling your vote for 50 kina, 100 kina, and you get the next 5 years, you get the children's future that you paid for with that 50 kina because you decided to sell yourself short. Your vote is the most important thing that you can use in terms of determining the outcome of your future. And if you sell it for 50 kina and you have that issue after the elections about, look, I got my 50 kina and now I'm trying to access the service or expectation from my member of parliament, they'll tell you, look, I paid you for this vote. And this is why Papua New Guineans, suppose online kam na toko sa meme, you vote osem, mani ba kamo sem, no kana rim tok. That's an illegal practice. It's a practice that will undermine your own future and impact the elections that we'll have in 2022.
The scary part about that, what you just mentioned, is firstly mobile phones were being led into the polling area, but also the people who are supposed to be at that polling area, who are electoral commission officials, or of course who have been endorsed, what do they call them, polling officials?
Yes.
So they were letting that happen.
And this goes back to my point about the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. If you have someone, a custodian of a law, that violates that process, either out of fear or favor, then they're engaging in corruption.
If you've just tuned in, our segment on this Friday morning on the Dabai show is with Transparency International, and of course talking about building elections integrity through partnerships. In the studios, Yombari Haihue and Alice Ariori, specifically talking about corruption, the different types of it, and corruption from an elections perspective. When you look at some of the national elections that we've gone through, and as you said, these observers, I know sometimes observers are coming in from abroad. They're being invited. What are some of their responses to what they're seeing in this country as compared to other countries in the region and other countries throughout the world? Obviously, development issues, countries which are more advanced would be probably the issues around this would be a little bit more secure, fighting against corruption and having this, but the observations and the comparisons.
Yeah. So the standard of the elections that international observers come to see in the country used to be a free, fair and safe election. So by free we mean that voters are able to vote without being pressured or forced to vote. Fair meaning that it's accessible to all voters, so women and people that live with disabilities, youths that have come of age are 18 at the time of elections, it's fair to them and they can vote. And then it's safe. People that are around communities where elections are happening don't feel intimidated. Young people, grade 12 students that have to sit for the election exams don't get moved around because of the electoral violence that is happening. So that is the standard of elections by international observers. It's also important to see whether the outcome of an election effectively reflects the will of the people voting in the country. Is the outcome of that election, whichever government or whichever officials that are put into office, do they reflect what the majority of the people in the country want to see? So in terms of international observation, reports in the recent elections for 2017 have all had issues, particularly around the issues of corruption I mentioned earlier. But corruption is also just one aspect of the conduct of elections. It also has to do with the administration of the elections in terms of logistical support, security, personnel, coordination, everything down to the printing of ballot papers, distribution of ballot boxes. It is a massive undertaking to deliver the elections, and we've seen in the recent budget that they've allocated 600 million kina as a substantial amount to deliver the elections. And now that the funding has been allocated, it has to be released so that the Electoral Commission can begin this work. For your listeners who might not be aware, the elections are only a few months away. They're starting in April. They've been indicated that the start of the elections will be April 28th. And so we have only a few weeks really left to ensure that this massive logistical undertaking doesn't get impacted, doesn't get undermined by the threat of corruption. And it's not an unforeseen threat. To your question about international observers, they've agreed with domestic observers that the incidence of corruption in the country has definitely had an impact on the outcome of our elections and impacted whether they're actually free, fair and safe.
And thank you for highlighting some of those issues, because it's important, I think, as we get to this time when the issue of which is going to happen, that it's not only about the awareness about issues around corruption, but the issues about the electoral process. Even to this day and age, there are still people exploiting issues around the electoral process, or maybe exploitation too is something that leads in from corruption or of sorts. But I guess what I'm saying is, through programs like this, where we are already having discussions, we're having conversations about it, our people can really understand. And just going back to what Alice and the team did, I'd like to find out your perspectives, Alice, about how people were responding to all of these awareness that you've done. You've gone into East New Britain, Central, East Subic Province and Mumbai Province. It's interesting, you haven't gone into the Highlands provinces as yet. It would be interesting to see if perceptions are different, how people are seeing it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so during our elections that we did in the provinces, there were a lot of questions that were centered around how to hold our MPs accountable. And so also during the elections, there were some very key messages that we shared with everyone to really ensure that you vote for the best candidate. And when you do vote for the best candidate, you can really eradicate corruption.
Yeah. And I think, political leaders at this time have also started to use that type of mentality. It's now thinking about the type of leader that will give you the best service that you think. Because they're also saying, this particular government saying, think about leaders who are going to give you services, service provision, rather than just, as you said, just voting for the day on its own, and you get a 50 kina back or whatever it is. It's just past the bottom of the hour, 28 to 11. I think we just have to take a bit of a break from all the talk. We'll take a quick break, but when we come back, we continue on in this program. I believe it's going to be a monthly segment. Yep, it is a monthly.
It's a series of 8 panel discussions that we'll be holding together with NBC.
Okay, so 8 panel discussions, and of course Yombari Haihue and Alice Ariori from Transparency International will be our key people coming in and talking about it. Who knows, they might bring in one or two others as the programs progress. It's important. It's Building Elections Integrity Through Partnership Project, BEIP project. And of course, this is an understanding between TIPNG and the National Broadcasting Corporation. Let's take a quick break. On the other side, we're going to talk about how corruption be minimized, or can corruption be minimized, and how we can do that.
It's a very specific role and requires certain skills. It's really important to have people in that office that are able to fulfill those skills, and Alice will speak to that. But to your point about the Melanesian leadership, I think one of the most important things that safeguards that process of integrity in our elections is that this is something that we've designed ourselves. The Constitution is something that was created by Papua New Guineans, for Papua New Guineans, after the extensive consultation in our country. Organic. I think the word is autochthonous. It's something that comes out of the people as opposed to brought in by external forces, like it wasn't given to us by the Australians, for instance. And by that I mean that this is what we aspire to as a nation. We know the complexities of our different societies, but we also know the standards of governance that happen. You press up your place, you press it down. You don't walk him something no hide. You like walking all people are custom up, you walk your place clear. What man masira na look him, harim. Look him something will him road to him. That's transparency. It's open.
It's transparent. Yep.
So how can you have processes that in the village that are transparent? And when you try to go to the modern processes, you don't walk in place clear. You okay hide now you go inside. That's not right.
Is it because there's a clash? Is it because there's a clash between maybe a white man system and a Melanesian cultural system?
Look, our law fundamentally gives equality to both. We recognize our traditional heritage, but we also have clear rights and responsibilities enshrined in our constitution. If there is a clash, and I don't want to use the word clash, I think it's really more that there's sometimes areas that need to be discussed openly, clearly, and positions need to be taken. And often when you don't have those clear discussions, people take advantage of those gaps. And if we don't have clear discussions around what are the expectations of a leader, what do we want out of members of parliament, those absences of information lead to abuse by people that might have their own personal interest, or that might not be suitably qualified to be, members of parliament. And when I say qualified, I don't mean in terms of a tertiary education. You don't have to be a PhD holder to be an MP, but you have to have those characteristics of leadership that Alice mentioned.
Yeah, and on that note, MP's responsibility. These are maybe we're coming towards the end of our segment, and then of course voters' accountability. Alice Alice, maybe you can tell us a little bit about MP's responsibilities.
Yeah, so when MPs get voted into the parliament, they have very specific responsibilities, and some I know a lot of you may know already, but it's very important to really know what their responsibility is. And I'll just give a number of them. So MPs' responsibility, they should check if taxes are being used wisely, question actions of government officials, meet with ministers to explain the needs of the electorates, meet with the local ward members to develop district plan. These are some of the very few responsibilities of MPs, but there's quite a number of them, and it's really important to understand what the responsibilities are, because you must expect some basic services from them as well.
Yeah, it's keeping leadership accountable, isn't it? Accountability is an important aspect around these issues around transparency, of course, and minimizing corruption. Interesting one, checking if taxes are being used wisely, because at the end of the day, we're all affected taxes. As the saying goes, it's two things that are always going to happen in anybody's life. That's taxes and death. So taxes is an important part about it.
Just make sure you don't get taxed to death, you know. but it's an important point. So when we talk about taxes, the important thing is when you're selling your vote, if you do sell your vote, and again TIPNG encourages Papua New Guineans to choose the candidates wisely, not to sell your vote. But if you give that 50 kina away, you're putting someone into office that has at a minimum 10 million kina per annum. That's every year, a total of 50 million kina to use on projects and activities. That's 50 million kina that comes out of your taxes. Out of every 1 kina you spend in a shop in Papua New Guinea, 10 toya goes to the government. And the person you put into office decides what happens to your 10 toya. And we need to have people that actually will use the 10 toya wisely. And rather than taking 5 toya into their own pocket and 5 toya to the one talk's pocket, actually use the 10 toya for the public interest.
Well said. So we've talked a little bit about MP's responsibility, questioning the actions of government officials, meeting with ministers to explain the needs of the electorates. Even when we talk about electorates, and I know this is an election year, one of the important things that has been always coming up is the electoral boundaries. All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, it's inevitable. Population is going to rise. There's going to be more people, and of course, there are going to be more people who want to be represented fairly. So. Electorates, understanding the needs of electorates is important, and then of course developing district plans. And I might add that in our line of work as well, it's always good to talk about district development plans with local members to see that there is some sort of way going forward, some sort of plan. Final one before we go, and look, listeners, there's going to be 7 more sessions, and I'm sure that we'll also have sessions where you can open up the telephone and ask for interaction. Final one is voters' accountability. Our vote is worth more than 50 kina. Your explanations before we wrap up our segment today.
Yeah, I think we've really emphasized that point, and I think it's something that Papua New Guineans often think about when they go to the polling station. Or even people in Mosby, you might see candidates driving around, they hold public forums, and they might share out cartons of, tin fish or bring bags of rice and drop off at places. You are giving your vote, if you choose to give it to someone who gives you rice for 1 meal for the next 5 years. That results in which school your children go to, what medical services you can access, the types of jobs you might have, and once you get that job, how much tax you pay. You're determining the next 5 years based on how much food you can get within an 8-week period. And if you do decide to do that, you're selling yourself short. One of the key things, and I think TIPNG always stresses, is that when it comes to corruption, the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain, it takes 2 to tango. It's not just our candidates who are abusing the process, it's also our voters that sell themselves short.
Of course.
And so that's where voters' accountability comes in. Yeah. You are the one that is entrusted with your own future. In a democracy, it's a contact sport. There are no bystanders, there's no one understands. You're on that field and you're playing. And if you choose to pass the ball forward and you choose to run out of the bounds, you're breaking the own rules. And how does it actually help you in the end?
And I guess that's a bit hard. When you don't, well, not you don't, but you got to work out what the right rules are to play by.
Exactly. But luckily, the rules have been set for us in 1975, and they get amended every constitutional period during the parliament. But the point of the matter is that citizens fundamentally also have a duty. We have to also be aware of what our responsibilities are as voters, and we have to make sure that we vote for people that will actually deliver on what our expectations are and not sell ourselves short.
So, voters' accountability, our vote is worth more than 50 kina. Do you know that your vote is priceless? When you accept money for your vote, it's a criminal act. It's called bribery. So you have to be very conscientious, or you must think before you're doing that. It's been a pleasure having you both. Before we wrap up, Alice, your last words, and then Yombari will wrap it up.
Okay, so we've basically gone through very important key messages, and I'll just go through them again. Number 1, voting for the best candidate with good leadership qualities, and that's really the values that I've mentioned: integrity, respect, fairness, accountability, transparency, and servitude. And there's so many other good qualities that you can think of. And the second key message is really knowing your MP's responsibility. When you're going, the elections are coming up, and when you're participating in the elections, do make sure you know why you're voting. You're voting because you want services into your provinces or your district. And the third key message is voters' accountability. Your vote is worth more than 50 kina, 20 kina, 30 kina, doesn't matter. Your vote is very, very important, and it makes a big difference.
Appreciate that. And before we wrap up, Yombari, your thoughts. I mean, we've got a few programs that we're going to be covering. Maybe give us a sneak preview into the next one. What topic we might be looking at, and then, of course, what we can look ahead to. And the other thing is, will there be an opportunity for listeners to call in and maybe voice and make some comments, talk in terms of talkback?
Thank you so much, Stephen. For the next few weeks, it's really looking at the processes that we outlined. You mentioned some of them around electoral boundaries, for instance, but also political representation, the role of security personnel like the police and defense force, political participation by women, for instance, why people should vote, so we can hear from also the youth perspective of why young voters it's important to get out there and vote. TIPNG is doing these segments in partnership with NBC, and so listeners, if you're out there, please put it in your diary. It's going to be every 11 to 12 on a Friday. We're also live streaming on Facebook, so for those of you that have social media, you can follow the TIPNG Facebook page where we'll be sharing live stream of the video. We also have a hashtag TIPNG elections for anyone that has any questions. We really do welcome feedback. Hopefully we do have radio panel discussions, and I'm hoping we can also get other voices apart from Alice and myself, expert voices that can contribute to this important discussions. And if at any point any of your listeners have any questions, they can always shoot us an email. Our email is info@transparencypng.org.pg, or just go onto Facebook and shoot us a message. It's our country, it's our democracy. We all have to take action.
Yeah. Well done to the. Sorry, did you want to say something before we wrap up, Alice?
Yeah. For those listeners who are from Jiwaka, Goroka, Niwalan, and Morbe, our team will be visiting these provinces this month. So we'll be doing Jiwaka and Goroka, and then immediately after that we'll do New Island and Morbe. So we look forward to coming there and sharing these very important key messages with you all as well.
Well said, Alice, and that's great. I'm sure our people listening out there will have that. Thanks to the both of you. From our side on the NBC, we'll see how best the program is tailored, so that if there is a segment, say, towards the last 10 to 15 minutes of the hour, if you can take calls, that'll be great. And then you have that interaction, you have that talk back, and not only is it about listening, hearing from your perspective and stakeholders and partners, but also hearing what the public is saying. That's so important. Great having you guys come in. Yumbari Haihue, Deputy Director, Partnership and Policy, and Alice Ariori, Project Admin, Building Elections Integrity from Transparency International. Thank you for your time. We look forward to the next segment next month.